Good evening. Thank you very much for coming to the lecture tonight. My name's Dr. Chris Watkins, and I'm going to speak to you today about the science of love, sex and attraction. If you'd like to find out more about some of the things that I'm going to chat to you about today, many books are available, but I recommend, for example, In Your Face by Professor David Perrett, who's from just down the road in University of St Andrews. And also a recently published book, The Chemistry Between Us, by Professor Larry Young from over at Emory University in the States, and Donald Alexander. My website currently has one or two studies that you can take part in if you're so interested to do so. And I'm always interested in hearing from anyone who wishes to contribute to our research and come to the lab and take part. Some of the work that I'll present to you today, two of the studies are my own, published and carried out in conjunction with colleagues from the FACE Research Laboratory who were over in Aberdeen at the time and now over in Glasgow. So I'd like to acknowledge them and my other collaborators from the past during my PhD. And some of the stimuli that I'll present to you tonight are presenting courtesy of them. And also thanks to Dan Ray, Dr. Dan Ray, who was from the Perception Lab down in St Andrews and is now working over in Toronto in the Raw Lab. So today my talk's going to be split roughly into three parts. I'm going to explain to you what science can tell us about what we like and how, and importantly, why we differ in our preferences for certain physical traits and potential partners. Today I'm going to focus on physical characteristics, particularly in the face, as opposed to personality characteristics. I'll talk a bit about what's thought to happen to us when we're aroused, what happens to our underlying physiology when we see somebody who we like, when somebody pushes those metaphorical buttons. And I'll conclude with some thoughts and hypotheses from researchers who try to look at human behaviour in light of evolutionary biology. In particular, how mate choice is changing and might change further in the future. But I'd like to start by posing the question of why we should ask science about what is inherently, after all, a personal experience. Why should scientists try to study aspects of our mate choice or measure aspects of our own sexuality? Regardless of whether it should do or not, the judgments that we make toward others based on their outward appearance influence many important social outcomes, such as who we mate with, date with, and potentially even hire or vote for. A classic anecdote here is from the Nixon and Kennedy presidential election debates back in the 1960s. Those who listened to the debates on the radio thought that Nixon had won on one hand, whereas those who'd watched the debates on the television thought that Kennedy had won. So aspects of outward appearance influencing the public's perceptions of what was at the time a very important decision for Americans. So who would you guys vote for from these two faces? Hands up who would vote for the guy on the left. Okay, hands up who would vote for the guy on the right. Okay, so a landslide victory, basically. These faces are from Alexander Todorov's lab over in Princeton University in the States. And these two faces differ maximally from each other on the trait dimension of competence, so how competent we perceive a given individual to be. So judges would agree that the face on the right looks more competent than the face on the left. And competence is an important trait dimension on which we judge others. This exact same lab looked at judgments of competence from just natural photographs of previous candidates in local and national US elections. And they found that judgments of competence from natural photographs predicted both the actual victor and impressively also the margin of victory in real past American elections. What's particularly impressive about this study is that this relationship was observed with only 1 second's worth of exposure to the candidates' faces in a computer-based task. So we don't really need a lot of time to make our mind up about a given face, it seems. The exact same lab has demonstrated that judgments made toward others at just 100 milliseconds are highly correlated with judgments made in the absence of any kind of time constraint. Important judgments such as how attractive, trustworthy or competent we perceive them to be. So in light of this, there's, if you like, kind of a prerogative, like an academic or even a societal prerogative to try and further explore the ways in which we might treat others differently based on outward appearance, using scientific methods. So we can measure what people like on average, and we can also investigate whether specific factors predict variation in what people like. So rather than just saying that everybody differs, we can measure whether or not people differ in specific ways. So what do we like in the face? So facial beauty might have an underlying, if you like, biological basis if it suggests some kind of underlying quality about the person who possesses it. So when I say quality here, I mean quality like in the Darwinian sense, not necessarily how good they are as a person. So things like beauty might reflect judgments of someone's good underlying health, their fertility, or their so-called good genes for your future offspring to inherit. There's some evidence which has tested this directly to suggest that this is the case. Australian researchers demonstrated that facial attractiveness is associated with an index of genetic diversity, referred to as heterozygosity. So from a Darwinian point of view, if we're looking at the biology of attractiveness judgments, it might be better to choose a heterozygous mate because their complementary genes might give your future offspring, if you like, more in their armoury to potentially fight off infections. So heterozygosity has been looked at one particular loci of genes known as the MHC heterozygosity. MHC heterozygosity has been studied extensively in different non-human species and has been related to the extent to which a given individual can fight off infection. And MHC heterozygosity is accessible within odour. So the classic paradigm in these kind of studies, looking at human attractiveness judgments, can, for example, get women to smell different T-shirts of guys and to see if their pleasantness or attractiveness rating of that odour correlates in any way with the man's genetic profile. In these T-shirt smelling studies, some researchers suggested that naturally cycling women, so women on not any kind of not on any form of hormonal contraception, tend to have a stronger preference for the odours of genetically dissimilar men at the MHC. In contrast, some studies have suggested that pill-using women on oral contraception, on the other hand, tend to have a stronger preference for the odours of genetically similar men at the MHC. This particular study, carried out by researchers over in Newcastle at the time, looked at the effects in the same set of women of coming onto the pill on their preferences for given odours in individuals, and tended to find a shift toward a preference for genetic similarity when women went from not being on the pill to being on the pill. So I'll return to the issue of why the fact that the pill use might on some level alter women's preferences for certain physical characteristics and potential mates. I'll return to that in the latter part of the talk in terms of what that might mean for human partnerships. So specific characteristics of the face, voice and body have been explored in relation to attractiveness. I'm going to focus mostly on the face here. So, of these two guys, hands up, who finds the guy on the left the more attractive of the two? Okay. And who finds the guy on the right the more attractive of the two? Okay, so fairly strong preference for the guy on the right. This time, who finds the woman on the left the more attractive of the two? Okay, one or two people. And who finds the woman on the right the more attractive of the two? Okay, so stronger preference for the woman on the right. These two face pairs, using computer graphic techniques, have been manipulated in facial symmetry. So in both cases, the male and female on the right are the symmetrised version of the given woman, man's and woman's face, using these computer graphic methods. And the man and woman on the left are the relatively asymmetric, i.e. non-manipulated face. And lots of researchers linked symmetry to attractiveness, such that judges tend to perceive the symmetrised face as being relatively more attractive than the asymmetric face. So the next pair of faces, hands up who finds the woman on the left the more attractive of the two. Okay. And who finds the woman on the right the more attractive of the two? Okay, so quite an overwhelming preference for the woman on the left. Who finds the guy on the left, this time, the more attractive of the two? Okay, and who finds the guy on the right the more attractive of the two? Again, okay, a fairly overwhelming preference for the guy on the right. So these two face pairs were manipulated in perceived health. These are facial composites. So essentially what you can do in the lab is get a given number of photographs of individuals rated for traits such as how healthy they appear to be, and you can make a composite by taking a given top and bottom percentage of a set of faces based on their rated health in this case, and extract the average characteristics of men and women who appear particularly healthy, and the average facial characteristics of men and women who appear particularly unhealthy. So in this case, the healthy woman here on the left, healthy guy here on the right, and lots of researchers linked perceived health to attractiveness, such that the healthy individual, as you did, tends to be perceived as more attractive than the relatively unhealthy individual. Yeah.
What did they do to make them look more healthy or less healthy? Or what did they change to make them look more healthy?
So it's computer graphic software that tries to extract, if you like, the average characteristics of a given set of faces. So in this case, this was surface characteristics. So if a set of faces have a predefined set of points, like if you like a template placed on the face, it can, for example, extract the average shape of a set of faces, or in this case, the average texture of a set of faces. And this is based on people's ratings of natural faces, how healthy they or unhealthy they believe them to look, to appear. Okay, this time for women only, who finds the guy on the left the more attractive of the two? Okay, and who finds the guy on the right the more attractive of the two? Okay. A high degree of consensus again. Guys now, who finds the woman on the left the more attractive of the two? Okay, who finds the woman on the right the more attractive of the two? Okay. So these face stimuli are from Dan Ray and Dave Perrett down in St Andrews, using a similar sort of principle to the health stimuli. These are composites. This time, a given set of individuals were rated in terms of how tall or short they appeared to be. And in each case, you have the average characteristics of a set of men who are perceived as being particularly short on the left, a set of men who is perceived from the sample as looking particularly tall, and the same line of reasoning for women. The tall composite, the tallest looking set of women from a wider group on the left, and the shortest looking women from the wider sample on the right. And lots of researchers suggested that height might be an important thing in how we pick and choose mates. So while women tend to prefer men who are relatively taller than themselves, guys tend to prefer women who are relatively shorter than themselves on average. So how might the brain, if you like, pick out these faces, or the mating mind, as Geoffrey Miller calls it in his book? How might we pick out a face from the crowd when we're trying to look for a mate? When we're looking for a mate, we might not express a preference for what, if you like, is aesthetically perfect, but instead we might prefer someone because they're, if you like, perfect for us on some kind of individual level. So evolution should have shaped the brain to make efficient decisions, even if we're not aware that we're doing so. So we want to minimise the chance of making a bad choice, so obviously we just don't pick people out at random. Consequently, what's interesting from a psychologist's perspective is that there may be a lot going on behind the scenes in the human mind as it's trying to strategise about how to select a mate, and when we express a really strong preference for a given type of individual without necessarily being able to articulate why. So for example, evolutionary theory predicts that there should be sex differences on average in how men and women might pick and choose potential partners. So two key factors from parental investment theory might account for differences, average differences, in the way men and women might view the mating game. So for example, women's reproductive lifespan, firstly, is constrained by time, whereas men's more or less is not. And secondly, men are better placed, if you like, biologically speaking, in a Darwinian sense, to produce more babies in spite of a poor mate choice decision. Given that there are sex differences in the absolute minimum period of parental investment, so 9 months for women, and at an extreme 2 or 3 minutes for guys. So if we try and take these two biological factors into account, parental investment theory would predict that there should be sex differences in what's called selectivity. So the proportion of potential partners that an individual is willing to reject. So parental investment theory suggests that there should be greater emphasis on women or the female of the species, or the more investing sex, trying to get it right when they pick and choose a mate, because they're the ones who suffer the relatively greater costs from a poor choice of mate in the biological sense. So from this sort of line of reasoning, females are thought to be choosier or more selective than males on average. And that's absolutely not the same as saying that men and women are hardwired to act in a certain way. Merely that you'd expect average differences in how women and men might go about the task of mate choice. And there's recently reviewed evidence to suggest that there is support for the evolutionary account. This example is completely anecdotal, but the reason why I called this talk Take Me Out is because, arguably this game show works precisely because it's women behind the panel doing the choosing and the guys coming down the love lift rather than vice versa. If you tried to speculate and apply parental investment theory to this particular game show, you'd predict after a given number of rounds of the game, the women on average would be more likely to turn their lights off than men would. Okay. But there is some empirical data to suggest that there are sex differences in selectivity or choosiness. So for example, across cultures widely different to our own, 40 different countries surveyed by Schmidt here, using a psychometric measure of men's and women's openness to the idea of sex without love or commitment. Men across cultures are on average more open to the idea of sex without love than women are. Recent work published also by face perception researchers over in Stirling and Glasgow found that men on average appear to be more attracted to novelty in comparison to women who are more attracted to familiarity, the so-called Coolidge effect that you might have heard of. So participants in this study were asked to rate the same set of faces on two separate occasions, and whereas women's attractiveness ratings of faces tended to increase on the second occasion, so demonstrating a stronger attraction to familiarity, guys' attractiveness ratings of faces tended to decrease on the second occasion, particularly when individuals were asked to judge faces as hypothetical short-term partners as opposed to long-term partners. Excuse me. These are two of many potential examples in which men and women might differ in their mate choice decisions, sexual strategies. A lot of work is focused on how women might differ from each other in their preferences for certain physical traits in potential mates. One of the key theories in this literature proposes that women's judgments of the opposite sex might vary according to, if you like, specific personal circumstances that sort of tilt the balance in favour of a given type of mate over another. To try and illustrate what I mean by this as one last example. So for women in the audience, hands up who finds the guy on the left the more attractive of the two. Okay, who finds the guy on the right the more attractive of the two? Okay, so fairly strong preference for the guy on the left. So guys, who finds the woman on the left the more attractive of the two? Okay. Who finds the woman on the right the more attractive of the two? so about even. These two face pairs are examples of exaggerated sex-typical physical characteristics. So masculine face shape in men and feminine face shape in women. So here, see the masculinised guy on the left, feminised guy on the right. These are composites. Masculinised woman on the left, feminised woman on the right. And across quite a few studies looking at men's and women's preferences for these sexual dimorphic traits, while men's preference for physical femininity, so feminine face shape in women, tends to be quite strong, there tends to be a high degree of consensus, and guys' preference for femininity, lots of research has suggested that there's quite a bit of variation in women's preference for masculine guys. Some research suggests that women on average prefer the masculine guy relative to the feminine guy. Some studies suggest the opposite trend, and some suggest that there's no overall preference for one over the other. And this is thought to, if you like, reflect the pros and cons of masculine men as long-term partners. Research suggests that it might reflect the trade-off between good underlying health and strength versus potential antisocial personality traits that are thought to be typical, on average, of masculine dominant guys. The media have cottoned onto these findings before and sometimes phrase it as good genes versus good dads. Might explain variation in women's preference for this physical trait. So I'm going to look at three studies on individual differences in face preferences. Firstly, two situations might alter women's strength of preference, so how much they desire a caring, sharing type male versus a dominant, healthy type male as a potential partner. So sometimes a woman might particularly value support from a potential mate or friend. People might particularly value support at times when it's currently quite lacking. My own work suggests, published last year, that not only are feminine individuals perceived to be better sources of high quality support compared to masculine individuals, but using a priming experiment, women who were primed to think of a time when they lacked a great deal of social support from others demonstrated a stronger preference for feminine-faced individuals in comparison to the women who were primed to just think of a time when they had plentiful support from others. Okay. And the same effect was observed in guys too. A stronger preference for femininity when they perceived there to be a lack of support, feminine face shape. So feminine individuals might appear more attractive to women when they think that support is lacking, and these kind of findings suggest that that individuals can vary their preference according to their current needs, and in turn this might help an individual to direct effort towards people who they think are particularly able to provide high quality support at times when it might be lacking. An alternative scenario might be when a woman doesn't want Mr. Right but instead wants Mr. Right now. Some studies suggest, face perception studies and voice perception studies for example, that masculine guys express a stronger preference for short-term uncommitted sex in comparison to their relatively feminine peers. So it might be efficient in this case, if you like, for the mating mind to shift toward a more masculine partner or express a stronger preference for a dominant guy if a woman's out all night to get lucky, as the song goes, or is just after the one thing herself. And research suggests that this is precisely the case. Women have a stronger preference for masculine-faced dominant guys for short-term in comparison to long-term relationships. And also in experiments where their sex drive is, if you like, activated experimentally, just by, for example, getting them to look at a series of particularly sexy images. So beauty in this case might be in the libido of the beholder rather than or in addition to the eye of the beholder. A third source of variation for how men and women might pick and choose mates might be the surrounding environment. People might do as the Romans do, if you like, when they're in Rome. The basics of so when we try to look at human behaviour from a Darwinian point of view, if you like, someone of the same sex is a potential competitor for a mate, and someone of the opposite sex is a potential mate when we view it in that way. The basics of sex ratio theory predict that the ratio of males to females within a given population might be important for competitive behaviours, or the extent to which we can be particularly choosing, if you like. So people might not get away with being as selective when there aren't as many good partners to choose from, or they might have to compete harder to attract a mate if competitors outnumber potential mates. So it's just an evolutionary biology, a way of looking at mate choice from the point of view of evolutionary biology, and the sex ratio might be an important predictor of behaviour in this domain. My work demonstrated that women alter their preference, the strength of preference for attractive traits, depending on the characteristics of the perceived sex ratios, the perceived ratio of males to females. We were interested in looking at women's change in preference for facial symmetry before and after they'd been primed with a slideshow of differing sex ratio. So either a slideshow where men outnumbered women, or a slideshow where women outnumbered men. And we found that women's preference for an attractive trait, facial symmetry, tended to increase when judging the sex that was perceived as being in the majority within the population, and tended to decrease when judging the sex that was perceived as being in the minority in the population. So women might be choosier depending on whether or not the numbers are in their favour. This might be reflected in women's attractiveness judgments. So they might express a stronger preference for attractive traits when there's relatively more to choose from, and equally might be more aware of attractive members of the same sex when the same sex outnumbers the opposite sex. When we try to look at individual differences in mate preferences, this kind of evidence suggests a degree of sophistication, if you like, in the mating mind. Because it suggests that we might be expressing preferences that are right for us without necessarily being able to consciously reflect on the fact of why. So we can't always articulate, for example, why a given person might be so special to us or stand out in the crowd, but evolutionary biology can provide a window into why this might be, is the line of reasoning. So given that somebody's caught your eye and you're attracted to them, what happens to our underlying physiology when they arouse our interest? simple interactions in the laboratory can alter men's and women's hormonal profiles. Experiments over in California found that just simply talking to a female confederate of the experimenter was enough to increase men's testosterone levels from baseline. And when the female confederate was asked to rate these guys for how extrovert or self-disclosing they were, the amount of information that they revealed about themselves in the interaction, those guys whose testosterone levels increased to a particular extent were also more likely to be rated as being particularly extrovert and self-disclosing. So in comparison to the guys whose testosterone levels didn't raise as much. So if you like, the effort, so to speak, that guys put into courtship seems to relate to their testosterone changes. It's been looked at in women too. Lopez and colleagues looked at women's testosterone levels and cortisol levels. These were measured after they viewed a video clip of Ryan Gosling from The Notebook. They were just asked to imagine themselves as being the object of his affection in the film. On women's testosterone and cortisol levels, so if you like, the stress hormone cortisol, they increased to a greater extent in this experimental condition. In comparison to the two control conditions, watch a clip of a relatively unattractive male and watch a clip of a relatively attractive female. So hormone levels appear to be released to facilitate courtship interactions, if you like, in both men and women. If you get to the hypothetical third date stage, sexual arousal can also alter underlying physiology. Research carried out over in Michigan by Sari Van Anders and colleagues asked women to provide saliva samples both before and after they'd engaged in the experimental activity, so they had sex with their partner, and before and after two control activities, so cuddling and exercise of the non-sexual variety. So women's testosterone levels were higher in the sex condition in comparison to the two control conditions, both in anticipation of and following on from sex. When she looked at changes in hormone levels, close physical intimacy also appeared to be important for predicting testosterone changes in women. The testosterone responses were actually greater in this sample in response to cuddling than they were for sex. So sexual activity, the experience of orgasm, cuddling, and specific to women, breastfeeding and childbirth, can stimulate the release of what's sometimes referred to as the love hormone, oxytocin. This hormone might, it's thought, promote positive judgments or positive behaviour toward others, which might include our partner. One of the first sort of interesting experiments to look at this was a double-blind, placebo-controlled experiment carried out down in Bristol by researchers down there. In this particular experiment, oxytocin was administered nasally to participants. They asked these participants, following on from oxytocin administration, to judge the attractiveness and trustworthiness of a given set of faces, and compared this to the judgments of the control group. Faces appeared more attractive and trustworthy in the oxytocin group in comparison to the control group. So these findings from this lab down in Bristol suggests potentially that the hormonal surge that's experienced through a good relationship, or possibly just good sex in and of itself, might promote positive judgments toward other people, which might include your partner. But oxytocin research is in its very early stages in humans. For example, to my knowledge, we know hardly anything about how naturally occurring levels of oxytocin might influence behaviour. But nevertheless, many companies and the media have naturally been quite interested by findings which suggest that administration of this hormone might lead to more trusting behaviour. Even in some cases over in America, marketing what's known as a trust spray was put out on the market. But it's really important to point out that there are caveats in how we should interpret these findings. I'll just use an example to illustrate this. Some of you might know or be familiar with this particular quote. So this quote was from Marilyn Monroe. But what you may or may not know is that Marilyn Monroe was thought to have suffered from borderline personality disorder. This disorder can result in great distress for both the sufferer and their loved ones around them. It's characterised by emotional instability, intense concern for being abandoned or rejected, but also paradoxically the sufferer can also try to downplay the importance of emotional closeness within a relationship. So relationships with sufferers of borderline personality disorder can entail many frequent arguments or breakups. A lab over in New York City were interested in this and carried out experiments where they compared trusting behaviour of people with borderline personality disorder administered oxytocin in comparison to a control group. And they found, so in a trust game, basically this was an economic game where you have to decide the extent to which you're willing to trust someone with a given amount of money. Because it's in a pair, it's player two who gets the choice of whether or not to reciprocate that trust. And individuals with borderline personality disorder are actually less trusting of individuals when administered oxytocin in comparison to the control group. This research group speculates that why this might have occurred could potentially be that if oxytocin administration makes trust issues particularly salient to a given individual, this might motivate feelings that a given individual wishes to avoid if it makes this particular group particularly anxious, for example. But the point that they're trying to make here is that person and context are very important when we consider whether or not oxytocin has a blanket overall positive effect on behaviour. And further research can sort of explore these issues. There are many ways in which our underlying physiology can change at different stages of a relationship and in different scenarios. I'd like to conclude by focusing on some suggestions on the ways in which mate choice, if you like, arguably is changing, some hypotheses, and how it may change further in the future. These are from a paper published by researchers over in Sterling and Florida, with some of my own interpretation added to it in parts. So tonight we've looked at mate choice in light of human evolutionary biology in part. Some might wonder why conditions from the past might exert any influence at all on human behaviour in the present. This might be because we tend not to think of human behaviour in the context of overall deep evolutionary time. For example, if life on Earth were condensed into 24 hours, modern humans would be present for the final 3 seconds of that day. Throughout these 3 seconds, culture has clearly changed much more rapidly in comparison to the human brain and anatomy itself. So when you consider this, what's called the mismatch hypothesis, there might be a mismatch between the culture or environment that we find ourselves in and the apparatus that, if you like, responds to it. So because our environment changes quickly, we're faced with many circumstances that are incredibly novel in the context of overall deep evolutionary time. There are 3 novel situations relevant to human mating. First is access to modern contraception. There are novel cultural influences on how we perceive ourselves and our own self-worth. And there are also novel ways to meet people, which might include a potential partner. So I'll outline these 3 hypotheses, if you like, in turn. So within developed nations, almost 17% of women aged 15 to 49 who are married or in some kind of recognised union use hormonal contraception. This figure varies markedly in different age groups and locations. So for example, over 80% of American women use some form of hormonal contraception, and nearly 2/3 of British women aged between 16 and 24, for example. The pill obviously has huge social benefits for female emancipation and female choice. But it's important for science to point out the potential costs of new innovations or inventions if it helps a given individual to make choices for themselves that for a given individual are useful for themselves. So I described earlier that people on the pill appear to prefer different traits in potential partners compared to those not on the pill. To be absolutely clear, the research is not suggesting that either set of preferences should be framed as better in any way than the other. But the point that other researchers have tried to make, how we can direct future research effort, is that changing preferences towards your partner might matter if a woman were to change her contraceptive status within a relationship at some point. And it might matter for the trade-off mentioned earlier between so-called good genes and good dad type males. One recent study compared women who did and did not take the pill when they met the father of their first child. In comparison to the non-pill using, naturally cycling women, pill users were less sexually and romantically attracted to their partner, according to self-report measures, but at the same time they were more satisfied by his emotional investment into the relationship and were less likely to separate in comparison to the non-pill using women. So this early research suggests that pill use on some level at least might contribute to aspects of relationship quality. Further research can try and test whether changes in women's contraceptive status might alter other feelings or aspects of sexuality. And this is important to look into if it enables a given individual to make informed choices based on their knowledge of this. Secondly, there are novel cultural influences on the way in which we perceive ourselves and our own self-worth. So the media can sometimes present unrealistic examples of beauty and might give a false impression of the number of beautiful people that there are in the world. This might be problematic if what passes in individuals' eyes on a day-to-day basis influences their perception of what is normal to them. Some might respond to this through cosmetic enhancement, a relatively recent option. For example, nearly 12 million procedures were carried out in America alone in 2007. Some of these procedures might involve trying to exaggerate the kind of sex-typical characteristics that we described earlier. So women might desire larger breasts or fuller lips, for example. An interesting hypothesis for future research is that in light of how we perceive beauty, greater uptake of surgical enhancement might result in a lower perceived benefit for a given individual who goes under the knife. So research suggests that we may judge people to be beautiful precisely because they're relatively unique or rare within a population. So if that situation did occur in the future, more people uptaking cosmetic enhancement, a given individual might, in theory, get less from it personally because everyone else is doing it. So in a weird way, cosmetic enhancement might become a victim of its own success if that's the case. I quite like this hypothesis because to me it puts paid this idea of trying to focus on what's truly unique about ourselves, our own set of experiences, our personality and our feelings, rather than focusing too obsessively on outward appearance if we wish to feel better about ourselves. And finally, there are novel ways of meeting people. So the internet is an extremely novel technological change in overall evolutionary time, influencing the way in which we view sex and the way in which we can meet potential partners. But new innovations are rarely without their bugs or costs for a given person. People are sometimes keen to use the terms evolution and progress synonymously, but it's important as an evolutionary psychologist, for example, to say that those two things are not one and the same. Evolution does not equate to progress necessarily. How might this be important for internet dating? Concerns about your own reputation are quite a normal aspect in how we behave when we interact with each other. But these concerns about your own reputation might not be as evident if people can express themselves with a degree of anonymity, as you can potentially do online. So as a consequence, people might be less trusting of those who they meet online. Potentially the ironic consequence that this might have for online dating is if that lack of trust leads online daters to put less emphasis on kind of the meaningful traits that they might want to find in a partner, aspects of their personality, and actually greater emphasis on the things that are easier for them to see with their own eyes, so their physical appearance. So purely through these dynamics of how people might interact online, individuals might end up focusing on surface traits, which could be a problem if the whole reason why you decided to go and take part in online dating was to find a long-term and meaningful relationship. So some of these predictions require further empirical testing to be supported directly, but they present to me anyway, quite an exciting prospect for future research, looking at how we can apply evolutionary thinking to understanding human partnerships. So an evolutionary approach to behaviour can deal with sensitive or controversial feelings or topics. And thinking about things such as, overall deep evolutionary time can run the risk of making us feel small or insignificant when we think of the grander scheme of things. But on the one hand, if evidence exists, if evidence in science exists to look at human mating, it's equally not that empowering or enlightening for it to be hidden from us if it helps us to understand desirable and less desirable aspects of our feelings. When I look at the evolutionary time metaphor, I like to sort of flip the logic a bit. Powerful statistics such as this can potentially humble us and make us reflect on what is really important in life. This might, for example, include taking the time to say or do meaningful things with the loved one sitting next to us, or the person waiting for us at home, or the person who we've yet to meet. Thanks very much.